Hello. Today we are going to discuss Petrarch's poem, That Long Love That in My Thought Doth Harbour. I will read out the poem first and then discuss it critically. That long love that in my thought doth harbour, and in mine heart doth keep his residence, into my face presseth with bold pretence, and therein campeth, spreading his banner. She that me learneth to love and suffer, and will that my trust and lust's negligence be reined by reason, shame, and reverence, with his hardiness taketh displeasure. Wherewithal unto the heart's forest he fleeth, leaving his enterprise with pain and cry, and there him hideth and not appeareth. What may I do when my master feareth, but in the field with him to live and die? For good is the life ending faithfully. I'm going to give a brief introduction to the poet and the form of the sonnet. This sonnet was originally written by Francesco Petrarch, who was a famous Italian humanist and scholar. It was later translated into English by Sir Thomas Watt and Henry Howard, the Earl of Surrey, both of whom were among the early poets of the English Renaissance. The version we are going to discuss is Watt's translation, which first appeared in 1557 in a collection of poems called Songs and Sonnets, or also popularly known as Tottel's Miscellany. Both Watt and Henry Howard are credited with introducing the sonnet form into English poetry. This form originated in Italy. The word sonnet derives from the Italian word sonetto, which means a little song, and was subsequently modified to suit English rhyme and meter by famous English poets such as William Shakespeare, Philip Sidney, Edmund Spenser, Samuel Daniel, and Michael Drayton. An English sonnet usually consists of 14 lines, all written in iambic pentameter. That is, each line constituting 10 syllables, one weak syllable followed by a strong one, and divided into 5 different feet. Traditionally, a sonnet constitutes 2 parts. The first 8 lines comprise what is known as an octave, and the next 6 lines comprise what is known as a sestet. The Italian form of the sonnet, which Sir Thomas Watt introduced to England, has a distinct shift in the 9th line in terms of tone and mood. This turn of tone and mood is commonly known as the volta, which literally means the turn. The English sonneteers who followed Sir Thomas Watt, however, modified the form to make the sonnet consist of 3 quatrains consisting of 4 lines each, followed by a couplet. This is best seen in the work of William Shakespeare. Traditionally, the Petrarchan sonnet consists of the themes of love and romance, wherein the poet addresses an idealized woman who is cruel and unresponsive and does not respond to his love. He complains about the cold-hearted nature of his lady love. A Petrarchan sonnet also typically consists of a set of images that are sustained through the use of particular metaphors, and the poet's love is compared using hyperbolic images. This kind of usage of hyperbolic images is known as a Petrarchan conceit. It is used to describe the poet's lovesickness by means of very unusual comparisons. The poet describes his love for the lady as long enduring, one that has stayed in his heart and mind and is finally making an appearance as outward manifestation on his face. He compares his love, his passion for the lady, to a marching soldier who's dauntless and puts camp on the enemy lines, declaring his presence with a flag. In the next quatrain, the poet describes how the lady responds to his addresses. The lady snubs him by asking him to restrain his passions and addresses towards her by citing reasons of modesty, honor, and respect. Having been snubbed by the lady, the poet's love now retreats back into the recesses of his heart, which he compares to a dense forest. the poet says that his passion is now languishing, weeping and crying. But in the final sestet, the poet's mood changes. From the passionate outburst that we witnessed in the octave, the poet now moves to a mood of cold detachment. He even says that he is helpless in the face of the timidity of his love. He personifies love and compares himself to a servant who is only subject to the wishes and desires and acts of his master, which is personified love. As a result of this, the poet withdraws any responsibility for the shift of his affections and says that he is innocent of the charge of cowardice. The poem charts the movement of the poet's passions from reverential admiration for the lady to cold indifference. The conflict in the poem arises when the lady dismisses the poet's addresses with a cold rebuttal. This conflict arises because the poet is divided between his feelings of reverence and respect for her and his feelings of physical attraction for her. This indicates that the passion that fueled the initial display of his affections was perhaps not strong enough to sustain it to the end. Therefore, the poet anticipates the natural death of his passions and distances himself from them, personifying love as his master, to whom he is only subjugated. He therefore justifies his own act of distancing himself and claims innocence of the charge of cowardice. The structure of this sonnet is typical of a Petrarchan sonnet. It consists of an octave and a sestet. The octave consists of 2 quatrains, 4 lines each, and the sestet consists of 2 tercets, 3 lines each. The rhyme scheme of the sonnet is ABBA, ABBA, CDC, CDE. Now, the rhyme scheme of the English sonnet was different from that of the Italian because Italian still retained the feature of inflected word endings, which was lost in English by the time of the English Renaissance. As a result of which, sonneteers like Watt and his successors tried a more varied form of rhyme scheme, most famously used by Shakespeare in his sonnets, where he employed the rhyme scheme ABAB, CD, EF, GG. Now, this particular poem is structured in terms of its rhyme scheme as well as in terms of the movement of thought. The first quatrain charts the motion of the poet's passions from within the recesses of his heart and mind to an outward manifestation on his face. In the second quatrain of the octave, this movement is stalled by the lady's cold rebuttal of his advances. Similarly, in the sestet, the first tercet charts the movement, the withdrawal of the poet's feelings and passions back into the recesses of his heart. Whereas, in the second tercet, this movement is countered by the poet's own withdrawal from his passions and his claim that he is innocent of the charge of cowardice because he is only subject to his master, the personified love. There is a corresponding internal movement within the octave and the sestet that mirrors the overall movement of feeling and thought in the poem. Thus, there is an outward movement of feeling in the octave and an inward movement of feeling in the sestet. Similarly, the first and the second quatrain mirror this movement of outward and inward, as well as the first and the second tercets mirror this kind of a movement. The rhyme scheme, which makes a very clear distinction and takes a very distinct turn in the 9th line, also makes this demarcation of thought of outward movement and inward movement very clear. The poet deals with a theme that is fairly common and popular across all Elizabethan sonnetteers, the theme of the poet's love, a lady who is unresponsive and cold. The unrequited love of the poet is something that is first described as bold and aggressive, which is then faced by the lady's cold rebuttal and thereafter retreats into cold indifference. Now, the poet deals with the theme of idealistic love. Idealistic love belongs to a tradition of love poetry that follows from the notion of Platonic love, wherein the lady is idealized and venerated to an extent that she becomes unattainable. Oftentimes, these poets addressed their love poems to ladies who were either unattainable because they were already married or because they were unresponsive, and oftentimes both. The idealistic nature of love is also shown to be inherently paradoxical because the poet has feelings of both respect and veneration for the lady as well as feelings of sexual attraction for her. This creates a conflict, a paradox within his own self, and is met at a point of crisis when the lady snubs his addresses by citing reasons of modesty, respect, and honor. As a result of these conflicting emotions, the poet faces grief and disillusionment and discovers that it is impossible for him to sustain the level of intensity of his passion that he first experiences for the lady. This leads him to the theme of the inconstant nature of his own love. The poet realizes that though he feels very passionately for her, when she snubs him, he is unable to sustain his romantic inclination in her and withdraws into a form of cold indifference. The poet also explores the theme of subjugation through the poem. The theme of subjugation is explored by means of the images that the poet employs. He is subjugated, first of all, as his body is made host to his feeling of love. His passion takes over his heart, his mind, and finally his face. Then he is subjugated as a pupil to his master, who is the lady to whom he addresses the poem. And finally, he is subjugated to personified love when he describes himself as a servile servant, only subject to his master's dictates and movements, and therefore innocent of the charge of cowardice. The poet employs a set of images from the domain of military warfare in the first quatrain. The poet compares the evolution of his feelings for the lady to the march of a dauntless soldier. By using words like harbour, residence, and banner, the poet conjures up an image of a marching soldier who is fearless and strides forward and sets camp on enemy lines, proclaiming his presence with a flag. In fact, the poet describes his own body implicitly as a host to the marching soldier, wherein his heart, his mind, and his face become sights through which his passion, his love progresses. Therefore, the poet's body itself becomes a site of struggle, the struggle between his feelings of reverence and respect for the lady and of physical attraction for her. In the second quatrain, the poet uses the implicit image of a pupil and a teacher by describing himself as an over-enthusiastic, ardent student trying very desperately to get his teacher's approval and attention. The lady herself is described as a strict teacher, austere and cold in her admonition of his eager show of affection. Thus, her dismissal of his advances is compared implicitly to a teacher who snubs a student and asks him to discipline himself by citing reasons of modesty, honor, and respect. In the sestet, the poet combines the images that he has used in the preceding quatrains, the image of the marching soldier as well as the image of the pupil who has been admonished and chided by his teacher. The poet does this by describing his love as one that has fled back into the recesses of his heart. It is like a soldier who has faced resistance on a battlefield at the hands of enemy and has therefore retreated, and his love is also like that of a student who has been chided and admonished by his teacher and has therefore gone and hidden somewhere. In the final tercet, the poet employs the image of a master and servant, and thereby he captures the theme of power and subjugation that has been implicit in all the preceding images that he has employed. The struggle for power that is implicit in the first image itself of his passion trying to take power and lay claim and siege over his heart, mind and body. The second image of that of a strict teacher trying to control her errant student, and then finally a soldier and a student retreating on having faced resistance. The theme of power and subjugation is therefore explored by the poet through the use of all his images, which imply a struggle for power of passion over the self. The language used in the first quatrain suggests the increasing impatience and vigor of the poet's love for the lady. The forceful sound of the verbs used in the third and the fourth lines, presseth, campeth, suggests the fearless, ambitious and dauntless march of the poet's passion and indicates the tone of aggression that is present in this quatrain. The subsuming of the poet's self, his heart, his mind, his face, to his passion indicates the intensity of his feelings for the lady. This passionate address has a certain element of excess, of pomposity, which is curtailed when the lady meets his addresses with a cold rebuttal in the second quatrain. Here, the profusion of formal words such as negligence, reason, shame, reverence, displeasure indicate the cold-hearted attitude that the lady has towards the poet. The bold exuberance of the poet's expression of love in the first quatrain is thus countered here by the strictness and austerity of the lady's admonition. There is also a slight hint in the first quatrain that the poet actually indulges his masochistic tendencies by complaining about the lady's cold-hearted attitude to him. Thus, the expression love and suffer can not only mean he suffers because he loves, but also that he loves to suffer. Love and suffer, like in the expression try and do. He loves to suffer. The hint of masochism in the expression love and suffer therefore indicates that the poet is perhaps also indulging in a degree of self-indulgent bitterness, not just in complaining about the lady's attitude towards him. The sestet reverses the effect that the octave created by using words that indicate the weak and cowardly nature of love. Words like fleeth, hideth, not appeareth, and feareth. The aggressive mounting of attack in the first quatrain has been replaced here by the love's helpless retreat into inaction. The tone here changes from aggression to that of cold, cowardly indifference. It almost becomes resigned towards the second tercet. In fact, one can detect a note of self-indulgent mockery when the poet claims that he is only a servant bound to his master, personified love, and is therefore innocent of the charge of cowardice. He distances himself from the blame of timidity in spite of the fact that his passions have experienced a downslide. In anticipating the death of his own passions and feelings for the lady, the poet's tone becomes almost mournful, but it is simultaneously also dispassionate. He is indifferent, and therefore his declaration of innocence is somewhat a strategy of self-justification. Though the poet's tone in the last line is seemingly mournful as he claims fidelity for his dying master, the personified love, this is perhaps only formal posturing on his part in order to justify his distancing himself from his passions. The poet deals here with a theme that is fairly common in all Elizabethan sonnets, one of unrequited love, which the poet experiences because the lady is unresponsive and cold. But the interesting thing is that the poet gives this standard theme of Renaissance sonnets a self-ironic twist, because he explores the inherently paradoxical nature of idealistic Platonic love. The reverence and respect that the poet feels for the lady does not mean that he doesn't feel sexual attraction towards her. and it is this inherently paradoxical nature of his passion towards her that is explored through the tension that constitutes the central point of the sonnet. The point of crisis in the sonnet that occurs in the middle, in the ninth line, when the poet is snubbed by his lady love, who does not reciprocate his feelings, indicates the fact that love alone cannot exist as an internal, subjective, totally unreciprocated emotion. It has to be reciprocated, otherwise it undergoes a diminishing of passion. This is a theme that the poet explores through the poem, and he offers a somewhat self-indulgent, almost self-mocking and self-ironical version of what is a standard feature, a standard theme in all Renaissance sonnets.